Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in Freshman English. We turn now in your hymnals to page 160, 161 and following. We'll be working now with a couple of texts. You can see it at the top of page 160. Look at it with me. We'll be working first with a text called If I Forget Thee, O Earth, a text by Arthur C. Clarke. And then we'll be working with a cutting from Rachel Carson's classic Silent Spring. Now, before we get into this, let's jump to 2B as we are often wont to do, and let's start at comparing themes there on page 160. First of all, let's write it down. Of course, in our nomenclature in 303, we talk about a thematic reading of a text at level 2A. Yes, themes and messages, you'll remember. But we want in this text, or in these study of these two texts, to compare themes. Let's get an operational definition of theme, though. There it is, the message or insight about life that's conveyed in a short story, play, another literary work. Sometimes it's explicit, stated directly. More often it's implicit, expressed indirectly. The way a theme is developed depends in part on the genre. Let's get that word down at 2B, right? We saw this word already in earlier lectures. Non-fiction, as we've already said, literature such as essays, articles, the meaning or insight is usually referred to as the central idea. Let's put it in our notes as thesis, because that's the nomenclature of the language we work with. A thesis statement expressing that idea may appear at the beginning of the word. Of course, fiction and poetry is a different genre. In fiction and poetry, the theme is often implicit. That means to say readers have to figure it out by looking at story events, the words, the actions of the characters, the patterns of related images and ideas called, and that's an important word, put it in your notes, motifs. We've used that word before, now we are operationally defining it. A motif is simply, as it says here, a type, all right, something that is an idea or a type that is going to be central to the text. The context or time and place in which the author is writing can also affect the expression of the theme or central idea. For example, an author living in a culture that values technology, that one was going to be important for our study here, might express a theme differently than what an author whose culture is not technologically advanced. As you analyze a work, keep in mind its cultural historical context. Now, I want you to notice this one. The following selections share a similar basic topic. You can write this down at 2A if you want to. The effects of human behavior on the environment. And more importantly, let's write down the word technology, because this is really going to be two texts that will investigate the ways in which technology affects the way we live our lives, okay? However, If I Forget Thee, O Earth is a short story. Silent Spring is non-fiction. So let's write that one down for If I Forget Thee, O Earth. This is a short story. The next text we'll work with, Silent Spring, is non-fiction. Because they represent two different genres, the two works develop meaning in different ways. As you read, complete a Venn diagram. It's provided for you down there below, like the one shown, to analyze how genre itself shapes meaning in the two works. On page 161, you have the central question, the big question, can truth change? And this one will be an important question for these two readings. Let's now meet Arthur C. Clarke, the first author, and his text, If I Forget Thee, O Earth. Notice your dates, 1917 to 2008, so you can see that his death, relatively close to us, lecturing now in the summer of 2018. He's born in England. Arthur C. Clarke was both a writer and a scientist, so write that down. That's big for him. He's a scientist. He wrote his first science fiction stories during his teens, and he later published more than 50 works of fiction and nonfiction. Although best known for his science fiction, Clarke was a serious scientist as well. In 1945, he published a technical article called Extraterrestrial Relays, in which he establishes the principles of the satellite communication system we have today. In other words, if you use a smartphone, you have to some degree, every time you've used that phone, paid tribute to Arthur C. Clarke. Now let's turn to the text itself. It is a strangely titled text. We've already said this at 2B, but let's say it again. Some titles are so easy and accessible. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. You know that this is a novel about a cat named Tom Sawyer. But a lot of our texts are going to have very strange titles like this one, If I Forget Thee, O Earth, which is kind of a really, by the way, the word thee just means you. If I forget thee, or you, O Earth. And notice the ellipsis at the end of the word earth. That is a very strange title. Okay, now in our selection here, we're going to be actually living on a space station, okay? We're going to have a 10-year-old named Marvin, so write that down, right? He is taken on a special trip by his father to the outside world. This trip will be for Marvin the first time he has actually ventured outside the station. All right? His father will bring him to a valley from which they can see an object in the sky. Marvin's father will tell his son that they are seeing the earth. Okay? Once home to humans, but now a wasteland, destroyed in a nuclear war. He wants Marvin to know what happened, so that the story can be passed on until the day that humans can once again set foot on Earth. Now, let's talk about this genre of text for just a moment. You're going to see it in your freshman year. You're going to see it in your sophomore year again, so let's talk about it. We often refer to these as apocalyptic texts. Now, what we mean by that is the following. During the 20th century, there increasingly became concern that the human species would destroy its own planet. All right? It was often referred to as mutually assured destruction, M-A-D. You can see that the spelling of the word is mad, right? And the argument was simply this. As the Industrial Revolution happened and technological advances began to occur, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a great amount of optimism. Yay, things are going to be great because of technology. For example, we will be able to solve all kinds of health issues. So we won't have to worry about things like chickenpox and polio and things like that, right? So in other words, the technologies that were evolving had all kinds of hope attached to them. But there was another side. It was the dark side. And the dark side said the following. There are two reasons why the human species will annihilate itself. One will be war, and more particularly, the nuclear war, right? So at the conclusion of the Second World War, when America drops those two weapons on Japan, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those atomic weapons, the Cold War began, as opposed to what? A hot war. A hot war is where people die in terms of bombs and that kind of thing. A Cold War is the threat of the use of these nuclear weapons, which ultimately could lead to what? Well, at the end of the first dropping of the first atomic weapon, the amount of death alone, and then the radioactivity that would occur afterwards, led any number of scientists to begin to speculate. If there were ever on this planet a large number of these weapons, and they were to explode all at the same time, it's very possible the entire human species could be exterminated. Not just because of the dropping of these bombs, but more particularly all the radioactivity in the air. I mean, once that stuff gets into the air, then humans can't breathe it, and now all of a sudden we've got extermination happening. That was the first concern. The second concern is kind of tied to it. I'm going to challenge you to think about how. We'll see this one, the second concern, in our second reading with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. The second concern was that there would be ruining of the Earth's environment. That all of the natural resources that are associated on the planet with our survival, water, air. I mean, if you don't have water and air, you can't survive as a human species. What happens if the water and the air on the planet starts to get jacked? Why? Now we'll see how these two things come together. Technology. Technology. Only it's different understandings of technology here. For example, it's those buildings, the building of all of those factories that are pumping all kinds of nasty stuff into the sky. It's the putting of serious stuff into our oceans that begin to contaminate our oceans. And yes, no question, today it is a subject in the political arena of all kinds of debate. The debate about global warming. Now this became, of course, a huge debate at the end of the 20th century, in large measure because of a text like Silent Spring, that begin to ask questions about all of the stuff that farmers were putting into the ground to try to take care of their crops. All of those pesticides. The prediction then is simply, now we're ready back to our term apocalyptic. The prediction is simply this. There will come a time in the future, and by the way, let's put it in our notes. These texts are always kind of future driven. They're always about the future. So for those of you who, for example, in middle school picked up a text like The Giver, and you read it, it seemed like it was a fairly normal text. We're writing about an experience of a group of people living. Granted, they have some whacked out rules. Granted, they have some kind of strange stories that they tell. It's only later in the text that you begin to realize, for those of you who are Matrix fans, the same game gets played all over again. For those of you who are Terminator fans, the same game gets played all over again. The idea is simply this. At some point, the human species has to actually leave this planet because it can no longer live on this planet. Now, the great H.G. Wells, you'll need this one in your notes at 3A. The great H.G. Wells had already played this game in a text called Time Machine, where instead of going to the future, instead of going to the past, he went into the future, but he didn't realize it. And in the future, what did he discover? People have to live under the ground. Why do they have to live under the ground? Because you can't live on the surface. Why can't you live under the surface? Because already the surface of the planet is starting to show that it can't allow for life. In other words, already at the beginning of the century, you have writers who are beginning to postulate about what does it look like when humans can no longer live on the planet. Now, of course, we could already ask you before we even get into this text at 3A, what is your favorite text? It could be a video game, it could be a movie, it could be a music video that postulates a future where people cannot live on the planet anymore because of some kind of environmental or some kind of nuclear holocaust, okay? One of the great ones that we teach in 303 is a text called By the Waters of Babylon, which we won't study in our freshman year, but I certainly recommend it to you, and I recommend that you write it down in 3A and take a look at it. That is one of the greatest stories that speculates about what it's like to go back to a city that has been destroyed by nuclear holocaust, okay? Now we're going to turn to this text by Arthur C. Clarke, and we're going to pay attention to the title, so write that down. What is up with this title, If I Forget Thee, O Earth? Okay, so right away we're going to ask about the theme of what is going on here. So let's turn now to this text. We're going to read along, paying attention obviously to the construction here, right? All right, let's go to work.
If I Forget Thee, O Earth, by Arthur C. Clarke. When Marvin was 10 years old, his father took him through the long, echoing corridors that led up through administration and power, until at last they came to the uppermost levels of all, and were among the swiftly growing vegetation of the farmlands. Marvin liked it here. It was fun watching the great, slender plants creeping with almost visible eagerness toward the sunlight as it filtered down through the plastic domes to meet them. The smell of life was everywhere, awakening inexpressible longings in his heart. No longer was he breathing the dry, cool air of the residential levels, purged of all smells but the faint tang of ozone. He wished he could stay here for a little while, but Father would not let him. They went onward until they had reached the entrance to the observatory, which he had never visited. But they did not stop, and Marvin knew with a sense of rising excitement that there could be only one goal left. For the first time in his life, he was going outside. There were a dozen of the surface vehicles with their wide balloon tires and pressurized cabins in the great servicing chamber. His father must have been expected, for they were led at once to the little scout car waiting by the huge circular door of the airlock. Tense with expectancy, Marvin settled himself down in the cramped cabin while his father started the motor and checked the controls. The inner door of the lock slid open and then closed behind them. He heard the roar of the great air pumps fade slowly away as the pressure dropped to zero. Then the vacuum sign flashed on, the outer door parted, and before Marvin lay the land which he had never yet entered. He had seen it in photographs, of course. He had watched it imaged on television screens 100 times, but now it was lying all around him, burning beneath the fierce sun that crawled so slowly across the jet-black sky. He stared into the west, away from the blinding splendor of the sun, and there were the stars, as he had been told but had never quite believed. He gazed at them for a long time, marveling that anything could be so bright and yet so tiny. They were intense, unscintillating points, and suddenly he remembered a rhyme he had once read in one of his father's books. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are." Well, he knew what the stars were. Whoever asked that question must have been very stupid. And what did they mean by twinkle? You could see at a glance that all the stars shone with the same steady, unwavering light. He abandoned the puzzle and turned his attention to the landscape around him. They were racing across a level plain at almost 100 miles an hour, the great balloon tires sending up little spurts of dust behind them. There was no sign of the colony. In the few minutes while he had been gazing at the stars, its domes and radio towers had fallen below the horizon. Yet there were other indications of man's presence. For about a mile ahead, Marvin could see the curiously shaped structures clustering around the head of a mine. Now and then, a puff of vapor would emerge from a squat smokestack and would instantly disperse. They were past the mine in a moment. Father was driving with a reckless and exhilarating skill, as if, it was a strange thought to come into a child's mind, he were trying to escape from something. In a few minutes they had reached the edge of the plateau on which the colony had been built. The ground fell sharply away beneath them in a dizzying slope whose lower stretches were lost in shadow. Ahead, as far as the eye could reach, was a jumbled wasteland of craters, mountain ranges, and ravines. The crests of the mountains, catching the low sun, burned like islands of fire in a sea of darkness, and above them the stars still shone as steadfastly as ever. There could be no way forward, yet there was. Marvin clenched his fists as the car edged over the slope and started the long descent. Then he saw the barely visible track leading down the mountainside and relaxed a little. Other men, it seemed, had gone this way before. Night fell with a shocking abruptness as they crossed the shadow line and the sun dropped below the crest of the plateau. The twin searchlights sprang into life, casting blue-white bands on the rocks ahead so that there was scarcely need to check their speed. For hours they drove through valleys and past the foot of mountains whose peaks seemed to comb the stars, and sometimes they emerged for a moment into the sunlight as they climbed over higher ground. And now, on the right was a wrinkled, dusty plain, and on the left, its ramparts and terraces rising mile after mile into the sky, was a wall of mountains that marched into the distance until its peaks sank from sight below the rim of the world. There was no sign that men had ever explored this land, but once they passed the skeleton of a crashed rocket, and beside it a stone cairn surmounted by a metal cross. It seemed to Marvin that the mountains stretched on forever, but at last, many hours later, the range ended in a towering precipitous headland that rose steeply from a cluster of little hills. They drove down into a shallow valley that curved in a great arc toward the far side of the mountains. And as they did so, Marvin slowly realized that something very strange was happening in the land ahead. The sun was now low behind the hills on the right. The valley before them should be in total darkness. Yet it was awash with a cold white radiance that came spilling over the crags beneath which they were driving. Then suddenly they were out in the open plain, and the source of the light lay before them in all its glory. It was very quiet in the little cabin now that the motors had stopped. The only sound was the faint whisper of the oxygen feed and an occasional metallic crepitation as the outer walls of the vehicle radiated away their heat. For no warmth at all came from the great silver crescent that floated low above the far horizon and flooded all this land with pearly light. It was so brilliant that minutes passed before Marvin could accept its challenge and look steadfastly into its glare. But at last he could discern the outlines of countenance, the hazy border of the atmosphere, and the white islands of cloud. And even at this distance he could see the glitter of sunlight on the polar ice. It was beautiful, and it called to his heart across the abyss of space. There in that shining crescent were all the wonders that he had never known. The hues of sunset skies, the moaning of the sea on pebbled shores, the patter of falling rain, the unhurried benison of snow. These and 1,000 others should have been his rightful heritage, but he knew them only from the books and ancient records, and the thought filled him with the anguish of exile. Why could they not return? It seemed so peaceful beneath those lines of marching cloud. Then Marvin, his eyes no longer blinded by the glare, saw that the portion of the disk that should have been in darkness was gleaming faintly with an evil phosphorescence, and he remembered. He was looking upon the funeral pyre of a world, upon the radioactive aftermath of Armageddon. Across 250,000 miles of space, the glow of dying atoms was still visible, a perennial reminder of the ruinous past. It would be centuries yet before that deadly glow died from the rocks, and life could return again to fill that silent, empty world. And now Father began to speak, telling Marvin the story which until this moment had meant no more to him than the fairy tales he had once been told. There were many things he could not understand. It was impossible for him to picture the glowing, multicolored pattern of life on the planet he had never seen. Nor could he comprehend the forces that had destroyed it in the end, leaving the colony preserved by its isolation as the sole survivor. Yet he could share the agony of those final days when the colony had learned at last that never again would the supply ships come flaming down through the stars with gifts from home. One by one, the radio stations had ceased to call. On the shadowed globe, the lights of the cities had dimmed and died, and they were alone at last, as no men had ever been alone before, carrying in their hands the future of the race. Then had followed the years of despair and the long-drawn battle for survival in this fierce and hostile world. That battle had been won, though barely. This little oasis of life was safe against the worst that nature could do. But unless there was a goal, a future toward which it could work, the colony would lose the will to live, and neither machines, nor skill, nor science could save it then. So at last, Marvin understood the purpose of this pilgrimage. He would never walk beside the rivers of that lost and legendary world, or listen to the thunder raging above its softly rounded hills. Yet, one day, how far ahead? His children's children would return to claim their heritage. The winds and the rains would scour the poisons from the burning lands and carry them to the sea, and in the depths of the sea they would waste their venom until they could harm no living things. Then the great ships that were still waiting